Oh, I thought it was coming up to midnight for the new year, and someone requested Shake, Rattle, and Roll. I wasn't doing too well till I heard the tape, and once I heard that, I said, well, let's...
Something. Have you ever heard a voice so beautiful it made you stop everything you were doing just to listen? A voice that seemed to come from somewhere beyond this world? That was Roy Orbison, the man in the dark sunglasses who sang like an angel and broke hearts with every note. For decades, people wondered about the tragedies that haunted his life and the mysteries that surrounded his career. But recently, new information has come to light that reveals the truth behind Roy Orbison's story, and honestly, it's more heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. What we've discovered goes far beyond the sad stories we thought we knew. This is the real story of Roy Orbison, and I have to warn you, it's going to hit you right in the heart. Roy Orbison wasn't just another singer from the 50s and 60s. He was something completely different. While Elvis was shaking his hips and the Beatles were winning over teenage girls with their charm, Roy stood almost perfectly still on stage. He wore those mysterious dark sunglasses and poured his soul into every single word he sang. His voice could climb to heights that seemed impossible for a human being. He could hold notes that made you forget to breathe. And the emotion in his singing? It felt like he was singing directly to you, telling you his deepest secrets and darkest sorrows. People called him the Big O. They said his voice was the most pure and powerful in all of rock and roll. Even other legendary musicians were in awe of him. Elvis Presley himself said that Roy Orbison had the most perfect voice he'd ever heard. Can you imagine that? The king of rock and roll admitting that someone else was better. That's how incredible Roy was. But here's the thing that always puzzled people. Why did Roy Orbison's songs sound so sad? Why did every note seem to carry the weight of unbearable pain? Why did it feel like he was singing from a place of genuine suffering? For years, people assumed it was just his style, just the way he chose to perform. But the mystery runs so much deeper than that. The truth is that Roy Orbison lived through tragedies that would have destroyed most people. And what we're learning now is that the pain went even further than the public ever knew. Let's go back to the beginning. Roy was born in Texas in 1936, right in the middle of the Great Depression. His family didn't have much money, but they had music. His father worked in the oil fields, doing hard labor just to keep food on the table. But somehow they scraped together enough money to buy young Roy a guitar when he was just 6 years old. That guitar became his whole world. He taught himself to play, spending hours and hours practicing until his fingers hurt. Music wasn't just a hobby for Roy. It was his escape, his passion, his reason for living. As a teenager, Roy formed his first band. They called themselves the Wink Westerners because they were from a tiny town called Wink, Texas. Can you imagine? A town so small that most people have never heard of it, producing one of the greatest voices in music history. Roy and his band played at local shows, at school dances, anywhere they could. And even back then, people noticed something special about his voice. It had a quality that made you stop and listen. It had power and emotion that seemed way too mature for a teenage kid. Roy's big break came in the late 1950s when he started recording rockabilly music. His first hit was a song called Ooby Dooby in 1956. It was upbeat and energetic, totally different from the sad ballads he'd become famous for later. The song did pretty well, and suddenly Roy Orbison wasn't just a kid from a small Texas town anymore. He was a real recording artist with a future in music. But Roy knew he was meant for something more than just rockabilly. He started writing his own songs, and these songs were different. They were dramatic, emotional, and told stories of heartbreak and loss. In 1960, everything changed when he recorded a song called Only the Lonely. This wasn't like anything on the radio at the time. The song built and built, with Roy's voice soaring higher and higher until it felt like your heart might burst. It was operatic. It was cinematic. It was absolutely breathtaking. Only the Lonely shot to number 2 on the charts, and suddenly, Roy Orbison was a superstar. The hits kept coming after that. Running Scared, Crying, Dream Baby, In Dreams. Each song was like a 3-minute emotional journey. Roy had this incredible ability to make you feel every ounce of pain and longing in his lyrics. His voice would start soft and gentle, then suddenly explode into these powerful, soaring notes that gave you goosebumps. And through it all, he stood on stage in those dark sunglasses, barely moving, letting his voice do all the work. People were obsessed with those sunglasses. Why did he always wear them? Some said it was because he was shy and the glasses gave him confidence. Others thought it was a marketing gimmick to make him seem mysterious. The real story is actually pretty simple but kind of sweet. Roy had regular prescription glasses that he wore because his eyesight wasn't great. One day, he accidentally left his regular glasses on an airplane and only had his prescription sunglasses with him. He had to wear them during a performance, and his producer loved the look so much that he told Roy to keep wearing them. The dark sunglasses became his trademark, making him look cool and mysterious, even though it started by pure accident. By the early 1960s, Roy Orbison was one of the biggest stars in the world. He was touring internationally, selling millions of records, and earning the respect of every musician in the industry. He had a beautiful wife named Claudette, and they had 3 sons together. From the outside, it looked like Roy had everything a person could want: success, fame, a family, and a gift that made him special. But this is where the story takes its first devastating turn, and where we start to understand why Roy's voice always sounded like it carried so much pain. In 1964, Roy and Claudette had a terrible fight. Their marriage had been rocky for a while, with tensions building because of Roy's constant touring and time away from home. They separated for a while, then got back together. But the problems didn't go away. Then, in June of 1966, something happened that would haunt Roy for the rest of his life. Claudette was riding her motorcycle in Tennessee near their home. Roy was on his own motorcycle riding beside her. They were coming up to an intersection when a truck driver didn't see Claudette and pulled out in front of her. She didn't have time to stop. The collision was devastating. Roy watched helplessly as his wife was thrown from her motorcycle. He rushed to her side, but there was nothing he could do. Claudette died almost instantly. She was only 25 years old. Can you even imagine? Watching the person you love die right in front of you, and knowing there was absolutely nothing you could do to save them? Roy was completely shattered. He threw himself into his work because he didn't know what else to do. He kept touring, kept recording, kept performing, but everyone who knew him said he was never the same after losing Claudette. The light had gone out of his eyes. The sadness in his songs wasn't just an act anymore. It was real, raw grief pouring out of him every time he opened his mouth to sing. Roy tried to move forward for the sake of his 3 boys. They needed their father to be strong. He needed to provide for them and give them as normal a life as possible. Music had always been his therapy, his way of processing emotions he couldn't express any other way. So he kept going, kept working, hoping that time would eventually heal the wound in his heart. But then came September of 1968, just 2 years after Claudette's death. Roy was on tour in England, performing for his fans overseas. He got a phone call that no parent should ever have to receive. There had been a fire at his home in Tennessee. A devastating, fast-moving fire that started while Roy's 2 oldest sons, Roy Jr. and Anthony, were inside the house. The fire spread so quickly that they didn't have time to escape. Both boys died in the flames. They were only 10 and 6 years old. Let that sink in for a moment. Roy Orbison lost his wife in a motorcycle accident, and then just 2 years later, he lost 2 of his 3 children in a house fire. He was thousands of miles away when it happened, unable to do anything, unable to even say goodbye. The guilt, the grief, the absolute devastation of losing so much in such a short time. How do you even begin to cope with something like that? How do you find a reason to keep living when your world has been ripped apart? Most people would have completely fallen apart. Many would have given up on life entirely, but Roy had 1 son left, Wesley, who had been staying with friends the night of the fire and survived. Roy knew he had to keep going for Wesley's sake, and somehow, impossibly, he found the strength to continue making music. But now, when Roy sang about heartbreak and loss, everyone knew it wasn't just performance. It was truth. It was the sound of a man who had looked into the deepest darkness and somehow found his way back. The mystery that people have wondered about for years is how Roy managed to keep performing after such unimaginable tragedy. How could he get on stage night after night and sing these emotional, heartbreaking songs without completely breaking down? Some people thought he must have been incredibly strong. Others wondered if he was in denial, avoiding his grief by staying constantly busy. But what we're learning now, what the mystery has revealed, is actually more complicated and more heartbreaking than anyone realized. Roy was struggling far more than anyone knew. He put on a brave face in public, showed up for his performances, smiled for photographs. But behind those dark sunglasses, behind that calm exterior, he was barely holding on. Close friends and family members have come forward in recent years to share what Roy was really going through during those dark times. And the picture they paint is of a man who was drowning in grief, but felt like he couldn't show it because so many people depended on him. Roy started having severe anxiety and panic attacks. The thought of performing would sometimes make him physically sick. He had nightmares constantly about the fire, about the accident, about all the things he couldn't prevent. He felt guilty for being alive when his wife and sons weren't. He felt guilty for being on tour when the fire happened. D. He felt guilty every time he felt even a moment of happiness because he thought he didn't deserve to be happy anymore. But here's the part that really breaks your heart. Roy never talked about any of this publicly. He suffered in silence because he thought that's what he was supposed to do. He thought he had to be strong for his remaining son, for his fans, for his career. He thought admitting how much he was struggling would make him seem weak, so he bottled it all up inside and let it eat away at him. The songs he wrote and recorded after the tragedies became even more powerful and even more sad. When Roy sang, you could hear every ounce of his pain. His voice would crack with genuine emotion. He would close his eyes behind those sunglasses and pour out his soul. Audiences were mesmerized, but they didn't fully understand that they were witnessing a man trying to survive by turning his grief into art. Roy eventually remarried in 1969 to a German woman named Barbara. They had 2 sons together, and by all accounts, Barbara helped Roy find some peace and happiness again. She understood his pain and his struggles. She gave him a safe space to finally process his grief instead of just pushing it down. Slowly, very slowly, Roy started to heal. The wounds never fully closed, but he learned to live with them. His career had ups and downs over the years. The music industry changed, and Roy's style of dramatic ballads wasn't as popular as it had been in the early 60s. He kept recording and performing, but he wasn't selling millions of records anymore. Some newer fans didn't even know who he was. But then, something amazing happened in the late 1980s. A new generation discovered Roy Orbison's music. Young artists started talking about how much he had influenced them. Director David Lynch used Roy's song In Dreams in his film Blue Velvet, introducing Roy's music to a whole new audience. In 1988, Roy joined a supergroup called the Traveling Wilbury. That's with Bob Dylan, George Harrison, Tom Petty, and Jeff Lynne. Can you imagine being in a band with those legends? They recorded an album together, and suddenly Roy Orbison was cool again. He was back on the charts, back in the spotlight, and this time he could actually enjoy it. He had worked through his grief. He had a loving wife and 2 young sons who brought him joy. He was finally in a good place mentally and emotionally. Roy also recorded a new solo album called Mystery Girl. It was some of his best work in years, showing that his voice was still as powerful and beautiful as ever. One of the songs, You Got It, became a huge hit. Everything was looking up. Roy was experiencing a career comeback, and he was actually happy. After everything he'd been through, after all the tragedy and pain, it finally seemed like Roy Orbison was going to get the happy ending he deserved. But life had one more cruel twist in store. In December of 1988, just as his career was taking off again, just as he was experiencing genuine happiness for the first time in decades, Roy died suddenly of a heart attack. He was only 52 years old. He died at his mother's home, and it was completely unexpected. One day he was here, making plans for tours and new music, and the next day he was gone. The world was shocked. Musicians everywhere mourned the loss of one of the greatest voices in music history. But for those who knew Roy personally, who understood everything he'd been through, there was an extra layer of sadness. He had finally made it through the darkness. He had survived unimaginable loss and found his way back to happiness and success. And just when things were good again, just when he could finally breathe, his heart gave out. Now here's the mystery that's been recently solved, the revelation that makes this story even more heartbreaking than we thought. Medical experts and biographers who've studied Roy's life have concluded that the stress and grief from those tragedies in the 60s likely contributed to his early death. The human body can only take so much stress and trauma before it starts to break down. Roy's heart, both literally and figuratively, had been broken so many times. The anxiety, the depression, the years of pushing down his grief and forcing himself to keep going, it all took a physical toll. What we're learning is that Roy essentially sacrificed his health and ultimately his life to keep making music after losing his wife and children. He didn't take time to properly grieve or heal because he felt like he couldn't. He had responsibilities and people counting on him, so he pushed through, performing and recording even when his body and mind were screaming for rest. The strength that everyone admired in him was actually slowly killing him. That's the mystery. That's the truth we've recently come to understand. Roy Orbison didn't just survive tragedy, he was destroyed by it in ways that took years to fully manifest. The saddest part is that if Roy had lived just a little longer, he would have seen how much his music meant to people. Mystery Girl was released after his death and became one of his biggest albums ever. You got it, and to number 9 on the charts. He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Artists from every genre talked about how much Roy had influenced them. His music lived on, touching new generations and reminding everyone of the power of a truly great voice and genuine emotion. Roy Orbison's story is a reminder that the artists we love are real people with real struggles. The beautiful music they create often comes from places of deep pain. Roy gave everything he had to his art, even when it hurt, even when he was barely holding on. His voice was a gift to the world, but it came at a tremendous personal cost. Behind those dark sunglasses was a man who experienced more loss than most people could survive. And yet he kept singing, kept sharing his gift with anyone who would listen. When you listen to Roy Orbison now, knowing what you know about his life, the music hits different. You can hear the genuine pain in every note. You can understand why his voice sounds like it's breaking with emotion. It's not an act or a style. It's the sound of a broken heart that never fully healed. It's the sound of someone who turned his suffering into something beautiful so that others could feel less alone in their own pain. If this story touched your heart, if you have a new appreciation for Roy Orbison and his incredible music, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who loves music or who needs to hear this story. And please, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another video about the real stories behind the music and artists we love. These stories matter. These artists matter. And by sharing their truth, we honor their memory and their legacy. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.